Not many people know that Sir Humphry Davy wrote poetry. This week we'll be asking, to what extent can Davy's chemistry be considered imaginative and creative? We'll look at Davy's friendships with poets, his own poetic output, and his views on the similarities and differences between science and poetry. In fact, Davy wrote poetry from an early age until his last years. He wrote poetry in a variety of forms and genres and on a range of topics. It has been estimated that there are over 150 poems written in his personal notebooks held here at the Royal Institution. Davy writes poems on the landscape of his childhood in Cornwall, such as the poem called Lines, which has the catchy subtitle, descriptive of feelings produced by a visit to the place where my first 19 years of my life were spent on a stormy day after an absence of 13 months. He writes poems on his experiments with nitrous oxide, the safety lamp, philosophical poems reflecting on life, his fame and his mortality, as well as poems written on his travels abroad and within Britain. Since only a few of his poems were published in his lifetime, many of them exist in varying states of completion in manuscript sheets and notebooks, in amongst records of his scientific experiments, accounts of his travel, and illustrations of geological strata. Davy was proud of his poetry. He would recite it at parties and circulate it in manuscript. The novelist Walter Scott said, "I have myself heard Davy repeat poetry of the highest order of composition." And Scott's son-in-law, John Gibson Lockhart, claimed, "Davy was by nature a poet." So can we ask whether it's possible to think of Davy's science and his scientific writing as themselves poetical? Throughout his scientific writings, Davy claims that chemistry is concerned with what he calls continual transmutations and changes of things. Later in his 1812 book, Elements of Chemical Philosophy, Davy reiterates the point that
most of the substances belonging to our globe are constantly undergoing alterations in sensible qualities, and one variety of matter becomes, as it were, transmuted into another.
In Davy's mind, chemistry and the imagination have the power to transform one thing into another. Chemistry has the power to modify elements and forms, to make solids into gases, or to reveal new elements through chemical processes. Similarly, the poetic imagination can modify and transform the world around us. In July 1800, on the suggestion of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet William Wordsworth asked Davy to proofread the second volume of the Lyrical Ballads. This book would become one of the most important of the period, held up as a manifesto for a new kind of writing, now called Romantic. After reading the preface, in which Wordsworth claimed that poetry was the opposite of science, Davy asserted in his 1802 discourse, introductory to a course of lectures, that chemistry was just as imaginative and creative as poetry. Next we'll hear from the biographer Professor Richard Holmes on Davy's poetry, and from the chemist Professor Mark Medovnik on Davy's scientific achievements. We'll look at Davy's notebooks with Professor Frank James, Head of Collections at the Royal Institution, and think about how Davy used his poetic talents in the lectures he gave here.